Hello, everyone.
Hi.
Hi. We're going to wait a few minutes because we had more people sign up that have not joined us yet, but welcome to Chanel for joining us again.
Thank you so much for having me.
And if anyone has any questions they want to ask and don't want to speak, just put it in the chat and I'll ask for you. Is anybody drinking a Cuba Libre? I added your recipe from your
did you?
To the RSVP.
I wish I was drinking a Cuba.
I wish too. I sent Stephanie the emails we sent out. I don't know if she's shared them with you so that you could see them.
Oh, okay. I didn't get to see them, but I love that you added that on the.
Yeah, we added it. A few more. Welcome to the new editions. We're going to start at exactly 7. We're just giving some more time for everyone that RSVP'd to join in.
Okay.
How's everybody doing?
I'm good. I wish I were drinking.
You're drinking.
I wish.
Why aren't you?
Because me and my crazy thing, I don't eat after 7. So that's it.
Well, I'm having Bailey's, not a Cuba Libre.
Oh.
We have a lot of punctual people this time. Hi, Tina. Hi, Debbie. So Chanel, we had about 20 RSVPs.
Okay.
So if everyone joins in that did RSVP, you will have as much as we had last time. So it'll be an interesting conversation.
I'm excited.
Okay, it's 7. So since we have an hour, I'm going to start, and anybody who joins in after that, they'll just be added on. So thank you everybody for joining us. Chanel Cleeton is with us again. Some of you got to be with us last time when she joined us for Next Year in Havana, and it sprung up a very interesting conversation, which she told me she enjoyed, and that is one of the reasons she's back again with us. And we'll be discussing the most beautiful girl in Cuba today. So Chanel, thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much. And thank you all for coming this evening.
And it was so interesting and I guess perfect time, even though that what's happening is not perfect, to be reading about this story based in the 1890s and seeing what's happening now and how so much of what you wrote resonated so much with the current circumstances.
Yeah, it was really, I mean, obviously I wrote the book in 2018, 2019, and I think I was editing a little bit in 2020. And so, while the current situation in Cuba wasn't ongoing, there were just so many parallels, I think, in the sense of kind of this ongoing fight for a free Cuba and this idea, I think that people have always had of what a free and independent Cuba would look like and what they've been willing to sacrifice their lives for. And so it really did resonate with me writing the book. If everyone's read the book, and I don't think it's a big spoiler, I end the book with the call for a free Cuba. And, part of that was how Evangelina Cisneros said she wanted her story to be ended. They asked her, and she said that she wanted it to be ended with the cry for Viva Cuba Libre. But also, it just struck me at how much that's a call that we all probably are familiar with in our families, and that sentiment being one that has continued on since, the initial fights for independence from Spain. So it really, it felt in a very sad way, like, kind of going full circle of the current fight for an independent Cuba and still not having that dream be realized. And I'm sorry, I mentioned earlier to Michelle, I'm a little bit under the weather, so I'm doing my best, but if my voice kind of goes out, that's what's going on. So sorry about that.
You sound great.
Thank you.
Okay, so kind of back to what I was referring to, your writing in this novel felt so heartfelt and in the moment, even though it was set 125 years ago. For the basis of the book, I know you can research the facts, but how did you come up with such a perfect dialogue to convey the emotions of the people then, which seem a lot to be similar to the emotions of the people now?
So honestly, I wouldn't even say it was that intentional. I think it just organically came from the history and what people were going through at the time, the discussions that they were having in Cuba about, what they wanted Cuba to look like for the women in Cuba, how they wanted to be represented in Cuban society. And so really going through all of that, the parallels were just kind of natural. I didn't really have to draw them myself. But what was really clear was just that love of country that, I certainly grew up with. And I think so many of us are familiar with, just that fierce patriotism and that sense of hope that, I wrote about in Next Year in Havana and has kind of pervaded all of my other books, where people have had this kind of ideal of what they wanted Cuba to be. And then at the same time, kind of the heartbreak of seeing that unrealized. When I started writing the book, I'll be honest, for those of you who don't know, my family is Cuban. My dad and my grandparents came over in '67, and I've, very much kind of grew up on their stories and their love for their home. My grandparents lived with us growing up. But, so much of my knowledge of Cuban history was really informed by the revolution and what my family's lives were like in Cuba and what it was like for them to leave, what it was like living under Fidel for 8 years. And so I didn't have as much of an understanding of more distant Cuban history. And my great grandparents would have lived through this fight for independence, but even asking my grandfather, what he knew about it, or if he knew about the reconcentration camps or any stories he kind of heard, he wasn't born that much after those events. He really didn't even have that much information on it. And so it really was an interesting process for me to sort of go back in time and just start to think about what my ancestors' lives would have been like in Cuba at that point. And it also, I think, just sort of helped me understand the evolving Cuban story of all that led up to the revolution and this constant fight for an independent Cuba and, the influence obviously that Spain had, and then the United States, and how we all kind of see that play out going forward. So as a Cuban American, it was just a really interesting thing for me to research, but it was very difficult to not feel emotionally connected, reading these stories and imagining, what these people went through. And, it's one of those things where my background's in international politics. I mean, I've studied genocide and those things, and haven't really studied. I don't think that many people know about just how brutal the fight for independence from Spain was. So it was really important for me to kind of bring that out for readers who maybe aren't as familiar with Cuban history, and to have that perspective.
And I know a few of the ladies on here are of Cuban American descent. And like you said, I believe that we're all very familiar to what happened from like the 60s to on, but whatever happened before that, we weren't had much knowledge of. My great grandparents would have also been there around that same time. And I don't know how accurate it is, but my family has told me that my great grandmother dated or had something with Jose Marti. So it was
Oh my
interesting.
goodness.
They lived like on the same block in the Keys at some point. So it was very interesting to like read him in the novel and get like an idea of what was happening.
Mm-hmm. No, that's an amazing family connection to have. That's really interesting.
Yeah, I wish I knew more. I mean,
yeah, no, that's a good story.
I've heard that he would like leave her. I don't know if he like was interested in her or if they actually dated, but he would send her like love poems. But that's
wow.
That's as much as I know.
That's amazing though. That's really amazing.
So reading it, I was like, this is what she was going through.
Oh. Well, and since you mentioned Key West, I will say, since you're all in Miami, I don't know if anyone's been to the San Carlos Institute in Key West, but I went for the first time in 2018, and that was part of what inspired me to learn more about this period in Cuban history. It's a cultural heritage center for Cuban history, and it's just a really interesting place to kind of look at the fight for independence from Spain. They have some artifacts. They have a statue of Martí, and it's really kind of, if you're down in Key West, I definitely recommend it for learning a little bit more about this period in Cuban history.
Oh, cool. Thank you. I have never been there, and I've been to the Keys a bunch of times.
Yeah, I just like kind of accidentally ended up there and then started to become inspired to write about this. So it was definitely serendipitous.
I know we've had some people join us since I said it last. If anybody has any questions and doesn't want to ask in the group, feel free to put it in the chat box and I'll ask it. And if you do have a question, just kind of wave me down. This is an open conversation. I don't have to be the only one speaking, so it's open to everyone. Okay, so my next comment is the opening scene with Evangelina describing her circumstances in jail was so extremely well written. It did a fantastic job of luring the reader in and wanting more. You definitely nailed that scene. One of the ladies on here actually messaged me when she started reading it saying that that's the kind of writing that makes her want to keep reading. Aww. So how or where did that inspiration for that scene come from for you?
You know, I just heard the character's voice kind of really strongly in my head, and it's actually Marina. When Marina ends up in prison, I kind of flipped it so that the reader would think it was Evangelina, but it's actually Marina when she ends up in prison. I kept it purposefully anonymous for that reason, but I feel like it was also kind of like a Greek chorus for the women who were in the prison and representative of you know, what they were going through at that time. I really was struck with you know, the stories of the women during this fight for independence. A lot of my historical fiction that I write is centered on women's stories because I feel like we don't often hear their voices represented as much in history. And so, you know, I wanted to kind of look at that perspective and see what it would have been like for them and what it was like for Evangelina to be in Recogidas and to sort of be in that position. My characters definitely speak to me pretty loudly in my head. And so really, I just kind of feel like I get to know them. I mean, it's kind of a weird thing to explain that you kind of hear them talking to you, but that's really what it sort of is like. And I feel like I just kind of put those voices and thoughts onto the page.
Now that you said that heroines talk to you, that was one of my next questions. Which character do you feel like you identify with the most and why?
You know, I think there were definitely aspects of each of the characters, and I mean, pretty much all of my characters, I try to find some connection with them. I find that that's really helpful for me. If I get to a point in the story where I'm sort of stuck or, you know, I don't know what direction they're going to go to, it's helpful if you have kind of similar threads that you can tug on and say, okay, you know, all of these things are different about our lives, but this is something we have in common. So how would I, you know, identify in this situation, you know, given that commonality between us? With Grace, obviously, you know, the fact that she was a journalist was very helpful. I think a lot of her kind of professional ambitions and struggles in a career that's very competitive and kind of uncertain, you know, just even dealing with writer's block, you know, as small of a thing as that is, that was something I could certainly relate to. And so that really helped me kind of forge a connection with her character. Obviously, Evangelina and Marina, you know, being Cuban, their love for their country, I identified a lot with them, and also they reminded me of the women I've been writing about and the women in my family and the stories I've heard. So that was kind of a connection there. Evangelina was tough. I mean, writing a real life figure was definitely a challenge, and especially a real life figure who had been so sensationalized during her lifetime. I really wanted to stick to what is known about her in the historical record, and I didn't want to fictionalize things about her just because I felt like her life had sort of been sensationalized enough. And so out of respect for her, I wanted to tell the story the way that she seemed to want to present herself, and wanted her story to be told. And at times that meant that there were things I just didn't know. And I decided, for me personally, my comfort level was that I would rather err on not having an answer to something than making it up, just given all that she had been through. I really I think, felt a little protective of her, just because of how much her life was sort of used by the American media and used by others, for their own agendas.
That you mentioned being a journalist, that leads into my next question. For me, as being a journalist myself, seeing the struggles Grace had to face to prove herself in 1896 still felt very relatable to 2021. And the struggles that women still face today. Do you think women still have to prove themselves more in the workforce? And second part to that question, who do you emulate the character of Grace after, and how did your story come about for her?
So, I mean, absolutely, I saw parallels between her story and, discussions, we're having now, what it's like to be a woman in business and industries, and feeling like you do have to prove yourself. Absolutely. And I think that was one of the ways that I connected with her, and with her character. In terms of modeling her, so she was really inspired by Nelly Bly, and she talks about that in the book, that Nelly Bly is kind of one of her role models. And so Nelly Bly obviously was on a larger scale. She was a more known journalist. I think she had a lot more, at that point in that time period, she was kind of further along in her career. She'd made a name for herself. She was pretty established in the media, whereas Grace is obviously starting out. But Grace was very much inspired by her career and her progress. And I really looked at the role of stunt women journalists in New York City and what those experiences were like, the kinds of stories that they were covering, the pressure they were under using pen names, how they were paid compared to their male counterparts. I mean, I wanted all of that to be true to the historical record, as well as that follows, what it was like for those women in the city at that time period. And I wanted that to come out in Grace's story.
Very cool. Her story was, I loved it, especially knowing that Hearst and Pulitzer is still one of the biggest media moguls till today. It was nice to see that rife between them happening in real time.
Yeah, and it was really fascinating. I did not know much about that before I started working on the book. I mean, really not, hardly anything about the two of them. And so, there too, I didn't really have to fictionalize anything because their real life rivalry and shenanigans were, exactly as I put it on the page. They would steal staff. They would have spies in each other's newsrooms. I mean, it was a historical record that was so rich with information that you just kind of found everything you needed for a fictional novel, just, in that record.
I thought that was a really nice, I didn't expect that at all. And as a person who, I love reading about the Gilded Age, especially, I'm a big Edith Wharton fan, and I just like that whole period in American history, and I think it's fascinating. And when I picked up the book, I really didn't even know what to expect, because the title really, first I didn't know much about that period in Cuban history, even though I feel like we all should have, and we didn't. It's sort of like our history started when our parents were around, and whatever, circa 1940 present time. And so I think, I just never thought about it. It just didn't really exist. But then when I first started reading it, and I see that you're talking about the rivalry between these newspapermen and, just Pulitzer and Hearst and what's going on and all this money. And they're just such prominent characters in this era of, United States history.
Mm-hmm.
And basically their sensationalism is like, I don't know, birth of the modern day tabloid almost, and how they exploit people, how tabloids now exploit people and blow them up, and people are almost victimized and you don't even realize it. So the fact that that was incorporated into this story about Cuban independence is fascinating to me, because it just was such a twist that I did not expect. You know, just like the Henry Flagler twist in your previous book, it was just like, you know, wow, because you come out of it not only being extremely entertained and wanting more and seeing where this family is going to go. The Perez family needs to continue. You know, we need more of those ladies, but you're reading it and you have to keep reminding yourself, you know, this is true. This stuff that I'm reading it really happened, and I was never, you know, aware of it. So the way you did that, and also I kept reading it and thinking to myself, this is such a feminist book, because, you know, always the women are strong in your books. They're always, you know, the central characters, and they're strong women. But this one especially, I think, especially the struggles of a female journalist at that time. And it was, I mean, I always say this, I said this to you before when we met before, but just, I mean, it's kudos, because it was just really just seamless.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, and I just, every aspect of it, I think, opened up all our eyes probably to pieces of American history and pieces of Cuban history that we probably never even thought of before. So.
Well, and I have to say thank you for that. And, you know, I have to say, really, the women in this book are so strong because the women in history were. And that's one thing, you know, I think sometimes, you know, I'll see people pick up historical fiction and they'll say, oh, the author, you know, wrote this through a modern lens. But those were the conversations that were going on in Cuba at that time period. I mean, women were demanding a different role for themselves. You know, they saw the fight for Cuban independence as an opportunity to improve their station in Cuba, and they were willing to risk their lives for it. And it was, you know, extraordinary reading about, you know, those women, you know, seeing what Evangelina went through, and definitely, you know, in the journalists in New York, like Grace, I mean, all of these discussions that we have now, you know, they were having back then. And so I didn't, you know, have to embellish too much, because it was all there, and these extraordinary lives that these women led. And then, as, you know, a Cuban American, I too, you know, it really was illuminating to me seeing that intersection between American history and American politics, and Cuban history and Cuban politics. I wasn't aware of it either, and how much of a role the American media played in getting the US involved in the fight for independence, and what an impact that had on Cuba. And so it was really fascinating for me as well, to kind of see those intersections. And I think, you know, I come from an academic political background, and we talk about globalization now, and, you know, this idea that there's all these connections in the world. But if you go back through history, you know, you see those influences, you know, happening even back then, and how interconnected the two countries were. So I found that to be, you know, very fascinating. Obviously, you know, it had some detrimental effect for Cuba, and that part was very sobering to see, that they went from, you know, the situation with Spain to basically, you know, being under American influence. But it was definitely interesting to appreciate that, and to kind of see how that impacted the 20th century in Cuba.
I see how it could open your eyes to the media now, and how influential they are, and we don't even realize it. The way that the media then basically orchestrated this whole thing, and how everything that's going on today is really, they're the puppeteers. They're just, you know, and we don't even realize it. And it was an awakening of sorts, just a reminder, at least for me, that kind of thing happened and continues to happen. So it was just on so many levels, at least, you know, I got more out of it than the, you know, the basic entertainment from it, and the reading a well-written book. It was just, you really come out learning something. So
yeah, there was a line in there that you wrote that said something about, you know, those that control the media really control the reality of what you see. Yeah, that was really like, because you're seeing it now with how the media is controlled, both in the United States and everything that's happening in Cuba and that has happened. And things that come out, you know, you Google Cuba and you see all these beautiful pictures and how it's supposed to be and how everything was covered up for so long. And it's really, if the media is controlled, you know, that's the reality that people think.
Well, it was interesting with the book because Spain, and I talked about this a little bit, you know, Spain was really censoring things. And I think, you know, in a way it kind of ended up being to their detriment, but they didn't see that at the moment. And so that was really kind of what shifted the influence in terms of what was able to get out of the country. And, you know, I think there were so many layers to it. I mean, you definitely had people who were, you know, looking to increase circulation. But there were also, you know, journalists who definitely thought, you know, they were seeing heartbreaking things come out of Cuba. They were seeing the reconcentration camps, you know, the violence and how unequal the fighting force was between the Spanish and the Cuban revolutionaries. And so I think a lot of people also did truly believe, you know, in what they were doing and did want to help the Cuban people. But there were so many different layers and kind of competing forces. And then obviously the circulation battle that kind of drove things up. So yeah, it was a really interesting time period. And there was a lot of gray. I mean, you would kind of sift through, you know, what was this person's motives, you know, and trying to understand that. And sometimes, you know, unfortunately, I wished like I could go back in history and actually interview these people and really, truly, you know, see through what I get from the historical record. Because it was tough, you know, it was definitely hard to get a full picture. You kind of do the best with the record and what it is. But, you know, definitely a huge influence on Cuba's future and coming from these American papers.
I really enjoyed reading about the secret groups in the US, like the Junta and the group of women that Rafael's sister led, because in my mind, there weren't that many Cubans here back in the 1800s.
Yeah, so there were a lot of those groups and they were very active. And that's one thing, you know, I haven't gone that farther back and that far back in history. This is the earliest book I've written in terms of going back in history. But yeah, I mean, realizing the immigration patterns and people that were coming from Cuba in the early 1800s, there was, you know, a thriving Cuban community, and a lot of them had left starting in 68 with the first fight for independence. You know, a lot of them had to flee Cuba, so they were in exile in the US, and they built up these newspapers, these groups, and really built relationships with the media, with American politicians, to try to advocate for Cuba abroad. But I do find it interesting, like you said, about kind of looking back at you know, immigration and kind of understanding what those Cuban communities were like, you know, in the early 1800s in the US. I think that would be really interesting. But yeah, it was definitely an influential group of people that were really doing everything they could for Cuban independence from outside of the country.
Sort of related, but more about your writing style. Grace tries to model her writing after Nelly Bly. Is there a woman that you look up to or try to emulate in your writing?
So I mean, definitely like a lot of authors that I really respect and that I love to read myself. I'm a really big reader. I'm probably a reader before, you know, I was a reader before I was a writer. And that's really, I think, kind of one of my great passions. I mean, even more than writing probably is just reading. So, you know, I find that I'm just so inspired by so many other people, but I think as a writer, writing is kind of an intimate experience. Like you're just kind of alone with your computer and your thoughts. And so really it's just me with my voice kind of putting what I'm feeling out on the page. I think it's a really cathartic process. You know, I find that if I'm having a bad day or I feel strongly about something, or, you know, I discover something that I find really interesting that I didn't know about before, that really comes out for me on the page. And so, you know, it's not like having a diary, but it's almost just kind of this process where you sort of shut everything out, at least for me. I don't really think about anything other than just what I'm writing. And I kind of let that be like a very freeing experience for me. I'm not a very creative person in any aspect of my life. So this is like my one creative outlet. Like I'm not musical, I'm not artistic, but this is like my one
You're a
thing.
writer, that's creative.
So yeah, I mean, it's my thing. So I think for me, you know, it just really kind of feeds a part of me that I need. And, you know, I'll notice if I haven't been writing or I'm frustrated with, you know, a scene or something, like I can definitely feel it in my mood. So yeah, I think it really just for me is kind of me needing to get out what I need to get out. And, you know, later on in the process, when I send the book off to my editor and she comes back and we tweak things, you know, then you start to kind of let more voices in and you start to think about, okay, you know, what do I need to do here? What does she want me to do? But those early drafts before it goes to my editor, my agent, those are probably the ones where it's just kind of a raw process. And then you go from there.
Can I ask a question based on that? What is your process like in terms of, so I am a journalist as well. I study communications, I actually teach digital media, and I'm a history major. So this is like, you know, every time I read your books, it just brings out a lot of me. I start researching more of my family. My family was involved in this war.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So my great grandfather was a general in the war. So I was familiar with it. I had a political grandfather from Cuba. So I think there's a lot of political passion in me when it comes to this topic.
Mm-hmm.
So with every book, I research more about my family based on whatever genre or whatever timeline you gave me, you know, to kind of think about. So I've always enjoyed that. But I find your writing in terms like, what's your process? Because there's so much history to this book. And in most of your books, there's always like three main characters that weave very nicely in and out without even, if you don't know history, like as somebody mentioned, it just kind of ebbs and flows naturally together. But knowing the history and probably the amount of research that you have to do to make this accurate, because it seems like that's very important to you in terms of your writing style as well. What is your process to get that? Like, do you get the characters first? You get the history topic first? Like, where do you go with that to make it so natural on paper?
So that's a really good question. And I would say it varies by book. So I kind of tackle each book, I don't want to say as a problem because that sounds unkind to the book, but almost like you look at each book and you're like, okay, what do I need to do for this one? So this book in particular is my absolute, no question, most researched book. And that absolutely informs the process. So I'll compare it to like Next Year in Havana. With Next Year in Havana, you know, I talked about earlier, growing up in a Cuban American household, had a lot of the heart of what I wanted to say. You know, I knew the basics of the history. I knew the things that I was going to put in that were kind of personal to me. You know, obviously with Marisol, I'm talking a lot about identity, which, you know, I didn't need to research. That was just me kind of talking through the book. So I didn't research beforehand. With that one, I started writing. Honestly, that was my easiest book to write in terms of it just kind of poured out of me. I think it was a story that was probably in me for a very long time. And so I just got it onto the page. I would research as I went in terms of, you know, like what event would help fit in with the plot, what date did it happen, how would that date affect the characters' lives, you know, that I would kind of fill in as I went. I would talk to my family, but it was definitely a process that happened at the same time. With The Most Beautiful Girl in Cuba, and I will say, so When We Left Cuba was a similar process. The Last Train to Key West was a similar process as well, but when I was writing The Last Train to Key West is when I realized I needed to change it. Because that book being set in the 30s, I was not as familiar with the history in the 30s. I was not familiar with the hurricane, you know, prior to writing the book. And so I was having to shift the plot quite a bit because I would find out like, oh, the ferry stopped running at 5 o'clock on this day and that affects my plot. So I would have to go back and change the plot. And it was really becoming counterproductive, like it was the most important way to do it. And so with that book, I realized, okay, we have to like rethink this. And so with The Most Beautiful Girl in Cuba, I front loaded my research. So I probably spent, I would say about 6 months researching, just kind of like full-time, you know, 9 to 5 researching. I read, watched, listened to like over 100 sources just to get all the different aspects of the book. That was kind of one of the things with this one is I felt like all of it went together. Like I felt like Evangelina's story was the newspaper story, was Cuba's story, but bringing all of that together was like 3 separate topics for research. Plus then you had the Gilded Age and the different settings. So it was intensive, and I would not have been able to write the book had I not front loaded the research. So basically, I started with an idea. I was down in the Keys. I was researching the last train to Key West. I went to the San Carlos Institute and then also the memorial for the USS Maine. And I realized, I don't know much about this. I remembered learning about the USS Maine in school as a kid, but it wasn't something I knew a ton about beyond like the basic sketch of the Spanish-American War. And so as I started researching, that's when I found out about Hearst and Pulitzer. I learned about Evangelina, and that's how I kind of started to populate the book. And then when I learned about the reconcentration camps, I knew that I wanted to bring that perspective in, just because I felt like it was such an important part of history that a lot of people don't know about. I didn't know about it. And I just really felt like it was a story that needed to be told. And I had been writing about the Perez family. I had grown attached to them. I'd been hearing from my readers that they were attached to them. And so I saw that as a moment to bring Marina into the book and have her be a Perez ancestor that we could sort of travel back in time with. So through the research process, I got an idea of who my three heroines were. I had kind of sold the idea to my publisher off of, the sketch of the history and the events I was going to cover in Evangelina. And then as I started writing and researching, the book kind of came out more. So I did about 6 months of research and then started drafting. And this one, there was a lot of, write, stop, do a lot more research, write, stop, do a lot more research. Just because there was so much to it. And I wanted to give enough of a background that what was going on in the book made sense, because it was further history, because there were events that people might not be as familiar with. I had to give a little more historical background than I maybe would have had to in Next Year in Havana or When We Left Cuba. And the other thing with this book was just the length of the time period the book covers. The last train to Key West is a short, you're a weekend plus or minus a few days. So it's a much shorter time span. This was spanning years. And so that was definitely something that, kind of opened my aperture in terms of the research that I was doing. And honestly, having the three heroines was largely in part to the fact that certain characters had limited POVs. With Evangelina, she's in Recogidas. She's sort of cut off at times. They would place her in kind of not solitary, but they would cut her off from outside contact because they were upset about the attention she was getting. So she often didn't know what was going on outside. And so to bring in that history, to bring in those events that were kind of happening behind the scenes to rescue her, I needed other characters to be able to do that because she just didn't have the access. And I didn't want to fictionalize, I mentioned that earlier. I really wanted to be true to what she knew. And the facts of her life. She was not in Cuba during the Spanish-American War. So to get that perspective, I needed a heroine that could be able to go to Cuba. And at the same time, Marina's in the camps. And so that's going to affect what she's able to have access to. So that was where the three women kind of all came together. And it was really just understanding what the story needed to tell the story that I wanted to tell. All of my books have strong political components. And so I wanted readers to see both that personal impact that it had on the characters, but also kind of the geopolitical things that were happening in the background that led to the situation. So that's kind of how it all comes together. I mean, every book's really different. So it just depends on the time period, and how much I'm covering with the book and what the story is that I want to tell. Each one, it's a little bit different.
Can I ask something along those same lines? Because I'd love how you go from one character to the other and the story just seamlessly keeps going and keeps progressing. But how do you just about your writing process, do you like map out one character or do you literally write from chapter to chapter?
That's another great question. So in writing, they have like plotters and pantsers, like that's what we call ourselves. And so it's people that kind of plot out the book and the story. And then people who write by the seat of their pants, so they don't plot before they start writing. I'm a pantser, but it is hard with this history. I will just be honest, because, I had to kind of keep a timeline straight. So I knew, you know, the book is really driven by certain events, obviously. And so I kind of wrote down like, okay, this happens at this point, this happens at this point. And that informed where my characters were going to be at that time and where I was going to cut scenes. And also, who is the person I want the scene to happen? Like, what point of view do I want to give the reader for that event? So often it's looking at, you know, who does this have the most impact on, or who would have access to this? And a lot of that just evolves as I write. So I'm just thinking like the example of the explosion of the USS Maine. You know, when I started writing the book, I didn't think, okay, I'm going to have Marina in Havana near the harbor watching the USS Maine explode. Like that was not something I had planned out. But as I was writing and I was like, okay, I'm in 1898, the war is going to kick off. I need to bring the explosion in so that readers can see it, see the impact that it has, and then it kicks off the war. I'm like, okay, Marina's in Havana and she's working as a courier. So this is a moment where I can take a historical moment, it works with the plot, and have her there so that readers see it. So it's often like finding opportunities like that where I can combine the two. So one thing too that kind of came up, and it's not substantiated at all, but there was like a mention in the historical record about Carlos Carbonell being kind of involved with the movement to, you know, with some of the American diplomats and that sort of thing. I don't know for sure that he was, but it's in the record. And so I'm like, okay, that's an opportunity that they can kind of come into contact. And I did fictionalize, obviously, because she's a fictional character, the part of him knowing her family. But I thought it would have made sense given, you know, Cuba, that they might have this connection. So really it's looking at opportunities like that where it's like a real life person and how can I bring in something fictional. I'm trying to think of other examples. It's really just working with the record I have and how can I bring those two things together. You know, Evangelina was in the US obviously during the Spanish-American War, so I thought, okay, she and Grace can go to lunch, and that's how I can kind of bring that scene. So it's a process. I mean, it's almost like a Rubik's Cube where you play with it, and sometimes it doesn't work and you move things back, sometimes it does. It really just depends on the characters in the scene. And, you know, for me, it's kind of twofold where I want it to move the plot forward. I want it to, you know, serve the fictional part of the book, but I also want it to be true to the historical facts and the narrative.
I have another, writing style question. And this one is about the love scene between Mariana and Mateo. I said the love scene seems so raw and like full of emotion, especially when they meet in the hallway when she has the meeting with Carbonell. Mm-hmm. How easy is it to write a love scene, or how is that process for you? Because I think super uncomfortable.
So for those who don't know, I wrote romance before I wrote historical fiction. So I will admit I've written a love scene or two in my day. So it's you know, something that's comfortable for me just because I've done so many. With that one, I'll admit also I'm a little out of practice though, because I used to do like 3 romances a year, and with the historical fictions, it doesn't happen as often.
Reading it wasn't like a raunchy scene. It felt so like full of emotion, not just like a love scene.
Yeah, I mean, for that scene in particular, I really was just thinking of kind of, I mean, the word you used, raw, is exactly, you know, I was thinking about kind of all that they had been through, how they were sort of meeting each other at this very difficult point, and how that would come across in terms of the emotional connection between them. So I did want it, you know, I tend to write like the ones with Grace and Raphael are a little bit more like maybe a little softer, but this one I just really felt like the emotion, given all that these two characters were going through and had been through, would really dictate kind of, and the fact that they were married, you know, they had this knowledge of each other, this history, and then they were coming together again. And so I really wanted that to come out for the reader. But no, it's, you know, I think everything with writing really is just practice. You know, the more you do it, I think the more comfortable you get. And I feel like with, you know, the more I write certain things, you know, you kind of get used to it and get more confident. I think writing is a lot of it is confidence. And it's hard. And that's why, you know, I said earlier, I kind of write like it's just me and the page, because I think if I wrote thinking about people reading stuff and like, you know, then it's just, you know, you kind of have to throw that out the window a little bit, because it's hard, you know, it's hard to put all that out there. So I just don't really even think about that part, and just kind of let it be my experience with the book.
One of the questions that was submitted by one of the ladies who read the book was about the current situation happening in Cuba. And she says, how crazy is it that what you wrote is resonating once again? What are your feelings about the current situation?
Yeah, it's, you know, it's heartbreaking. I think that you look at how much Cuba has struggled through history, how much the Cuban people have struggled, how much they've sacrificed, how much hope they've had, and how that hope has not come to fruition. So it's definitely something that's always on my mind when I write these books. My editor is not Cuban, and, you know, I think she kind of was always like, wow, you know, when she reads Cuban history and just kind of sees like how long the struggle has been, because she doesn't, you know, have necessarily that background. But yeah, it's, you know, I think it's incredible to see the movements coming out of Cuba, the courage that they have, and given what they're facing from the government. I mean, it's really just an extraordinary thing. And you want to hope so badly that they will be able to be successful and to support, you know, however you can. So definitely, you know, it's something where I've been trying to, you know, learn as much as I can, share as much as I can. I think, you know, a lot of what they're going through is, you know, their experiences and what they've kind of gone through in the country. And I can't say that I certainly, living in the US, you know, can, I've not had those experiences. And so I just have tremendous respect for, you know, the struggle that they've had, and how much they're fighting for independence. And obviously, you know, I think we all are just so hopeful that they will be able to see a free Cuba, and that human rights will be, you know, in Cuba, that they will be able to live as they should be able to. But it's hard, and it's disheartening, I think, when you look at the timeline of history and you realize how much has come down to outside influence, or how much, you know, you came close to something and then it just, you know, didn't turn out. And, you know, that's the hardest part, is you really do wonder, has Cuba ever, you know, had much of a chance, you know, given how much outside influences played a role. So I don't know, you know, I think it's been 62 years now, and, you know, you hope for better. I mean, it seems like the rest of the world should see what's going on and step in, but obviously, you know, we've all seen so many other times when we thought, you know, things were going to happen. So I don't know, but definitely, you know, my thoughts are with them, and just trying to kind of share, you know, as much as I can from Cuban voices on the island. I feel bad, you know, I think so many people want to kind of speak for what they think is going on in Cuba. And I think the best thing, you know, we can all do is just listen to these voices and share them, and respect the struggle that they're going through.
Yeah, definitely.
I wanted to say, because when Michelle started the meeting at the beginning, talking about the prologue scene, and one of the lines that you had written was that she says, "They will not break me." And as I was reading the book, you know, I always think of my family members. I had spoken to Michelle about it. The book made me think a lot about my grandmother, who was born in 1903. So it was right around the time she was born, and, you know, in her first years. And I think I was even more interested in the book. I read it in the last couple of days. I hadn't purchased it yet, and she had said, go get it. And I think it even, yeah, it caused me.
Oh, you froze.
Me to pick it up even more so because of what's happening, we're breaking up. But I think what I wanted to say was how you're saying that, you know, it's been 62 years, but the book makes us, at least for me, it made me want to go back and have more conversations, ask more questions, get more information. Because like you say, for us to be able to understand it, it has to come from the viewpoint of somebody who has lived it or who is currently living it. Mm-hmm. I can share it from an emotional standpoint because I've seen the hurt in my family, my mom, and that line like just hooked me into the book, because every woman in my life is a fighter and nothing will break them no matter what they've encountered. And I feel like I finished that book with like this purpose of like, I want to sit down with my mom and I want to have her write that story. And I feel like everyone here that is Cuban American should do the same, because that's the only way that we can impart that information. And I think that you've done a beautiful job through your writing. When I read the Havana book, the same, I would tell Michelle, I'm like, I feel like I'm speaking to my grandmother as I read this book, because the only way to learn about it is from those firsthand accounts for us to be able to understand it. And I feel like you opened that door for me to want to research more about my own family. And at least to be knowledgeable, to not just speak from an emotional, you know, standpoint, like, because of course we're all emotional about the situation, but being able to speak about it with knowledge and being able to back up what we're saying or what we're fighting for with that knowledge.
Well, and I think, you know, Cuban history and politics is so misunderstood, you know, by so many people. And we're seeing a lot of that now where, you know, information is coming out about Cuba that's just not accurate and you're kind of having to counter. And so that's why, you know, I do hope that these books kind of help give a perspective. You know, as someone who did not grow up in Cuba, you know, I try to kind of balance wanting to share things with obviously it not being, you know, my place to certainly speak on certain things. And in those situations, I think just trying to uplift those voices and listen to them. But also, you know, I think it's hard with the older generations passing on. You know, my grandmother's been gone now 13 years. And, you know, having lost kind of that perspective, you know, now that I write these books, I have the memories of what she told me, but I wish I could, you know, go back and ask her what certain things were like for her, and not having that is definitely tough. So I feel like for our generation that maybe didn't experience it firsthand, but we grew up on it, you know, we're kind of like the torchbearers where it gets passed down to us, and hopefully we can then pass it down and kind of keep some of those memories alive.
I have one more question. We would think that we would learn from history. It seems Cuba has spent its existence fighting to be free and offered citizens equal humanitarian rights, even back in the 1890s. How do you think the story of this novel relates to present day, and what can we learn from history to put into use today?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think the story of Cuba is, you know, kind of a story at times of history repeating itself. And, you know, also when you look at this fight for independence, I mean, Fidel kind of tried to make this, you know, connected to his revolution and sort of tried to say, you know, that they were all fighting the same fight. I think for those of us who come from exile communities, you know, we sort of see it as part of our fight and our hope for a free Cuba. You know, you have that connection looking back at this idea of Cuba Libre. I think it's, you know, a complicated history, you know, it truly is. And when you go, you know, back and you look at how many people have had interest in Cuba and how that has affected things. And, you know, even within Cubans, I don't think there's one, you know, monolithic Cuban experience or perspective. And certainly in this book with this particular fight for independence, you know, you had Cubans that really wanted the US to get involved. And they were doing everything they could to pull the US in. You had Cubans who were concerned that if the US got involved, what happened would happen, and that Cuba would just become under American rule. And so, you know, there's so many kind of layers to this. You know, obviously my hope is that the Cuba that, you know, so many people have given their lives for, this idea of a free and democratic Cuba will come to be. You know, and I don't know exactly what that'll look like, but I hope I'm able to see that. I think it's heartbreaking to imagine the amount of sacrifice that people have undergone in terms of their lives and just everything, you know, with this belief, and to not have it be realized. Like, you almost feel like at some point it has to be, because the force of our ancestors and the power is so strong that at some point, you know, this will have to be.
We have a few more minutes with you, and I hope we don't go over, but
No.
I know we've asked you a lot of questions, so maybe we can give you some feedback or insight on what we thought of the book. If everyone would want to, if you don't want to, you don't have to, but anybody would like to, maybe share who was their favorite character and why, or your favorite part of the book. For me, I really liked Grace because I identified with her professionally, but I really loved Mariana and her want to fight and do something, even though she was a stay-at-home mom in those days, and she still found a way to communicate and fight and make a difference, which was, in my view, very feminist of her, considering the time that she was living. So anybody else?
I'll go ahead and chime in. First, before I say my favorite character, I want to say thank you. Along with what Eileen was saying, your books have allowed me to have conversations with my grandparents that I haven't had in years since I was little, and I would just hear their stories. And now they're just, you know, being able to have those conversations of even, you know, beyond their own history. Like this, what this book provided was was amazing, and it allowed for us to have memories that, you know, I'll cherish forever. So thank you. And I want to say my favorite character was Marina, more so because of the way you developed her as a mother. And after having 2 kids, and it gets me emotional, the scene of her dropping off her daughter at her parents' house just like completely destroyed me. Chapter 29. So that chapter made me ugly cry beyond belief. And it's just, as a mother, I resonated with her, and I was like, I can't even imagine what these women went through, having to protect their children and still be able to provide and be strong and still fight for a country that they love for so much. So, you know, it also allows me to respect and love even more, if that's even possible, my grandmother and my mom for what they did to be here. So I thank you. And that character would definitely be the one to have pulled all my heartstrings.
Well, and I have to say too, you know, I think we're seeing that so much with Cuban mothers, you know, throughout history, you know, obviously with Peter Pan, you know, with Cuban parents, and that's why I included that scene. And then obviously what's going on now, you know, we're seeing parents be put in these situations they shouldn't be. So
she was also my favorite character in the book. I think probably for the same reasons, because every time I've read the books, especially this one, I keep thinking of my grandmother also. You know, she sent 2 of her kids here first, then she came when she left 2 behind, and like she had so many goodbyes before they were all reunited. And you know, she had goodbyes that were never reunited, like her sisters that she never saw again. And for me, this character just taught me the resilience that she had. And it, you know, I was talking to, maybe it was Michelle the other day, that I was saying, like, if I could have, like, I would almost want to apologize to my grandmother for like not taking more time to really understand her story. I think when I became a mom, it was easier, you know, to understand now, because I think now with everything happening and seeing the videos, you know, coming out from Cuba, and I think of my own boys, like what kind of strength does it take to be able to put your children on a plane or, you know, on a boat at the young age of 9 or 10 or 11 years old, and not ever knowing if you're going to see them again. So I think those characters for me just reminded me of like the resilience that I come from, I guess, and all of us with Cuban American, you know, blood. I want to say that it's incredible to me, and I resonated so much with that.
I liked all of them, and I have to say, in all of your books you have such strong characters that it's so hard really to pick like a favorite one. But I have to agree with Michelle that Grace was my favorite because she was curious. She was curious enough to step out of her comfort zone and go find out what was going on in somewhere else to help other people. And she had that compassion for people that she had no ties to. She had nothing, like, you know, like a lot of people now, they're so apathetic to everything, like, oh, who cares? It doesn't concern me. But she had that, like, insert word here, go out and like do something about it.
Yeah, I agree. I loved the scene when Grace went to both Hearst and Pulitzer and asked for a job. One, because women weren't really working at the time, and to have the guts to just show up and be like, you need to hire me as your writer, was really inspiring. I
think my favorite was Grace as well, only because it's a different perspective than what, you know, it's somebody just mentioned that there are no ties, there's no information. She really didn't know what she was getting herself into. And, you know, that character develop from a point of, you know, just trying to get the story to a point of empathy throughout the book and towards the end, and her establishing a friendship with Evangelina, and you know, that it's something that is, it would continue, you know, and having that understanding come out. I think that's really important. I'm struggling with that right now as far as with my son. My son is 17 years old, and you know, obviously my grandparents have been gone many, many, many years, you know, 25 years plus. My father's gone. There's a lot of people that are gone. There's nobody left really. And it's difficult for him because I am the gatekeeper. I am the storyteller now, and he doesn't get it. And the past week has been an eye-opener for him. And it makes me, you know, think, okay, I can resonate with Grace, because I need to now, how am I going to tell this story? I feel like giving him your book and saying, here, read it. He'll laugh at me and tell me no, because, but I feel like it almost should be curriculum for our children, right? Mm-hmm. You know, because we're losing a lot of it.
Yeah.
And, all we have are the stories to go on, and the regrets of not having had more stories to go on for a lot of us. And, you know, I don't want it to be lost. Mm-hmm. And I think that the character of Grace, at some point, it went from, I want to get the scoop and I want to get the best job and I want to be like, you know, the best female journalist out there and make my mark, to, no, I need the story to be told. And I need to be compassionate, and I need to tell it in the right way. And I think that mirrors your writing as well, because you're trying to tell the story the right way.
Thank you.
And so she's my favorite.
Thank you. I will say for your son too, I don't know if you've watched One Day at a Time. It's the show Gloria Calderon-Kellett did, but I feel like that's a good one for someone. And then there's a book, The Cubans by Anthony De Palma. It's nonfiction, but it's really good too. I really, really recommend that one for kind of understanding life in modern Cuba. It really impacted me.
There's also a great Netflix series that's a docu-series that's called The Cuban Life. The Cuban Libre Life story. And it goes through each stage of history.
Yeah, that one's good too. And then Waiting for Snow in Havana is really good too.
That's an excellent book. And there's a book that Diana Venciana Suarez wrote many years ago about her experience. As I think it resonated a lot with me, because it's, you know, not to date myself, but my generation with, you know, and I think it resonated because we could all relate. You know, the parents came, and the parents are, you know, growing up struggling, and us not having anything. I mean, our kids now, this new generation is totally separate from that. Their experience, I mean, these are second generation Americans already, for a lot of us. And, you know, I think it's important. I see it because I have an older son, but I also have 2 young sons. And I'm sure most of you, you know, have smaller children. And so you're thinking, oh my gosh, you know, I have to perpetuate this. I have to keep this going. And you don't want it to be lost. And you want to make it important. And you want to make it something in the forefront, you know. And it makes me angry sometimes. And I'm sure all of you can relate to this, watching the news and saying, not enough is being done. Not enough is being said. Not enough people are getting involved. And you see people crying for help and people putting pleas out there all over social media. And there's nothing else we can do, you know, except inform and continue telling those stories. So Chanel, you better write another book, quick, ASAP.
Thank you. Thank you.
Quickly.
I'm editing my next one. I am.
Does anybody have anything else they want to share? Favorite part?
I just have a quick question. The hockey game that was occurring in my living room just ended like 5 minutes ago. So do you as an author get, because I'm into audiobooks, I commute to work like 30 minutes, so that's when I listen to my books. Do you guys, like authors, do you guys choose the people that read your stories?
So that really depends. It depends on the publisher. Like sometimes I've had books where they've not consulted me. I mean, honestly, publishing, sometimes information doesn't trickle down. So like sometimes you'll realize you have an audiobook because like a reader's like, oh, I listened to your audiobook. And you're like, I didn't know I had one. So it depends. I have asked for, like if I have a Cuban character, I prefer a Cuban narrator. So sometimes like I'll get input there, or like because you're someone who's Latinx, like I will ask for that. Sometimes I don't honestly know how publishers, like they have certain relationships with certain people, and I don't know that part of it. So they can't like always, you know, I don't know if you can always request like a certain person, but if it's a continuing relationship, they try to make you happy and work with you. But it just depends honestly on the publisher and the book and the author, and yeah. but I've been happy. I mean, I think my publisher has done a great job. And I've actually, I don't know that people realize this, but I have different publishers for some of my Cuba books on the audiobook side. So Havana and When We Left Cuba are a different audiobook publisher, and then Key West and Most Beautiful Girl in Cuba are different. So that kind of affected too, like who they could get, because it was different publishers.
Yeah, because for this book, Grace had like an American accent, and then Marina and Evangelina had different accents. So just wanted.
Yeah, I try. I mean, if it's a Cuban character, I try to ask for a Cuban audiobook narrator or Latinx. So yeah, I think that's kind of how they've been doing it.
Anyone else?
I just want to say thank you also, Chanel. And my favorite character also was Marina. And just as many of the others on here tonight, definitely making that connection as a mom. And I read the Waiting for Snow in Havana from their last Zoom that we had. And I'm currently reading he wrote a second one, Learning to Die in Miami. And in that one, he goes more into detail about his life here once he was here in Miami. And it's just, her character really resonates with what, the hope, the desperation that these parents had for their children. And that, throughout history, it seems we see that pattern with them. And you just did a really great job with that. And I have a question, because I know that this Next Year in Havana was a Reese Witherspoon book club pick. Any chance of a movie coming along? Because she makes a lot of her book picks into movies.
So there are things in the works on the TV side, not with her production company, but with a different company. But that process is such a long and unpredictable process. So I will admit I'm just kind of like along for the ride at this point. I don't know too much about how things are going to turn out. It's a whole different industry from, what I'm used to with publishing. But, fingers crossed, I think it would be interesting to see it, and we'll see what happens. So.
Is Next Year in Havana, I know you have the Spanish rights being sold abroad and it's accessible here, but are they going to be sold in the US?
That is always my number one thing I ask for. I think right now the Spanish edition, which you can get through Amazon and Book Depository, I know it goes in and out of stock at times. I think that's really the best way to get it. I ask about it a lot. And it's just one of those things. I don't have sub rights to my books. So I kind of mentioned that with my audio, the main edition of the books, I sell to my publisher, and then my publisher does the distribution for all the sub rights. So it's just one of those things where I ask and I'm hopeful. And, I'm really happy that it got published by Meva in Spain. And, I'm at least that we can get it on Amazon and Book Depository. And I'm kind of always looking to see if there's other ways to get it, because I realize sometimes, it'll go out of print and then goes back on, or, the price goes high. So I try to kind of keep an eye on that. But that's the best information I have on it right now. But if I hear more, I'll definitely share it.
All your books need to be translated into Spanish.
I do ask, believe me. So it's one of those things. I'm always fingers crossed that we'll see the others, definitely. So, and you just can't predict which languages end up getting translated, and sometimes they'll pick up some books in the country but not the other books, and it's just kind of a whole other side of the industry that I'm still kind of learning and figuring out. So.
Before we start to wrap up, anybody else have any comments or anything you want to share with Chanel? Last chance. Okay, Chanel, I know you mentioned you're working on your next novel and editing. Anything you can share with us? Because, we are your #1 fans, I think.
Oh, thank you.
I know we started with Next Year in Havana, which was a book you wrote about 4 years ago. Mm-hmm. And I know since then, a lot of the ladies have read your other 2 books, even though they weren't book club picks. So what's next?
So Isabel's story is next. It will be out next summer. I think I can say May-ish for right now. I have a cover. I love the cover. We have a title. So I think we'll be able to start announcing that soon. In the next few months, I'm editing it right now. And I apologize to Michelle. I'm a little bit you get kind of like an editing haze. And often I'm talking about a book I wrote like 2 years ago. So my brain's like in the book I'm writing and editing, and I have like 3 different ones going right now. But yeah, I'm really excited to be able to share more, and you know, hopefully soon we'll be able to kind of share the book description and the cover. I think it's my favorite of all my covers, so really excited for that. And I can say that the book picks up where When We Left Cuba leaves off. So we kind of meet the family at that point, and then we also have a thread in the past that kind of gets tied into. So
okay, is there any info on what's after that one? Because I know sometimes you have 2 at a time.
Yeah, so I was drafting my 2023 release, which is going to be the story of the Morro Castle, which is the cruise ship that caught fire in the 30s. It was coming from Havana to New York. And so that one, I'm still drafting. So it's very, very early on that one. But I'm really excited for that one. And that one will be out in 2023. Yes.
Well, thank you for joining us once again. If we can have you again next time for your next release, we would greatly love it.
I would love that. Thank you. This is always so wonderful. I really, it just means so much to me to kind of hear everyone, you know, talk about their history and their connection with the book. She saw me get emotional earlier. So no, it's just really special to be able to share that and to just feel like, you know, we're all a big community, and to have that connection is amazing. So thank you all so much for your support.
I mean, reading your books, I wish my grandparents were still alive. They passed when I was in my 20s, so I wasn't in the mindset of thinking of history at that time. I know that when I knew one of them was about to pass, I tried to get as much like personal history of like her relationship with my grandfather, and because I never met him, but I wish I would have had the time to sit and write her personal story. So thank you, because I feel like, especially with Next Year in Havana, you gave me a glimpse of that.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much.
Before we leave, can we take a group photo? And if anybody has their,
sure. I have mine too. I can hold mine.
Yay!
You do it on Kindle.
You can hold up your Kindle.
My Kindle's in the other room, so
smile.
It's here.
Okay, 1, 2, 3. And I'm gonna do it one more time just in case, because these screenshots work very funny. Okay, 1, 2, 3. Thank you, everybody. And thank you again, Chanel.
Thank you so much. This is wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you. Have a good night.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye, everybody.
Yeah.
Bye.
No next book club pick?
Oh, yes, there is. I didn't want to know.
You were going to say something, but I didn't want to say it. Oh my God, I got so nervous in front of her.
Why?
I don't know.
This is awesome, Michelle.
Thank you. The next book club pick, I'll send out the email this week. I actually just got confirmation from We Have an Author again.
Okay, yay.
It's a thriller. It's The Fiancé by Kate White, who is the former editor of Cosmopolitan.
You're gonna post it?
Yeah.
Okay.
You're signed up for the email, so you'll be getting the email.
Yeah.
But the author literally just confirmed today, so.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yay.
When is that for? Do you have a date for that?
Yes, September 20th will be the discussion.
Okay. I have some time to finish this one because I'm in chapter 28.
Yes.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Jennifer.